Welcome to Gnous House. And I'd like to thank Heather for allowing us to use this venue this evening. I'd like you to meet my friend Merlin, and we're here to carry on with some of the things we've spoken before. We have nothing particularly special to say other than we should be careful in the current times, but fortunately it's the time of year where the roots of the plants are receiving the energy ready for a regrowth, and that is with us at a Christmas period at the end of a year, where a tree that lives a different life to us experiences its long day a year long.
Oh, thank you, John. It's nice to have another conversation with you again on these Gnostic subjects for the Gnous House. So I'm hoping that we're going to have some more fun today telling stories about Milarepa at some point, I believe. Or at least you had something like that in mind, I think, did you? But it's definitely a time for going within in the winter time, as you say. And so winter, and also during this lockdown period and these quarantines, and we were talking about this another time, weren't we? Where people are being forced, because a lot of people haven't been going out so much, and they've been forced to be more with them, having to be with themselves a lot more indoors. And in the winter time, and for a lot of people that's quite daunting, because they think of loneliness or depression or need for stimulation. And actually, if you look at nature at this time of year, the winter, as you're saying, everything's going into a kind of repose, into a rest period, hibernation, and as humans, if we look to nature as this is the time of year when everything else is going more inward, and if we follow that invitation ourselves and to go more within and use this time more for rest, then there's a lot that can be gained from that, isn't it? And that's probably a scary concept or idea for a lot of people to go into self-imposed solitude and recluse, and yet at this time many people are being forced into that anyway, although that's not necessarily what they want.
We spoke before of quarantine being a 40 days of voluntary shamanic training in the wilderness, and we're now faced with a different kind of quarantine which doesn't relate to that spiritual value. However, we as people in the modern world may not be able to access a cave in the Himalayas, but most of us, fortunately, have a reasonable place where we can meditate safely.
That's right. We don't need to go to a cave in the Himalayas. We can set up a space in our own space, hopefully, can't we, somewhere, and that can serve as our cave.
Yes.
It's simply a space where you're putting worldliness down for a time.
Yes.
So in the modern context, that could mean switch off your computer or your phone, the electric lights, light a candle, make a space somewhere you can sit and burn some incense, and just lay worldly things aside for a while and go within. And I think for a lot of people that's quite challenging thought, for perhaps people who've never thought of doing anything like that before. I mean,
well, there is a great amount of shamanic tradition that starts there, but I would like to add incidentally that earlier on I'd had the internet on, and I'd been playing the radio, and I had had enough, and I turned off all the electrical equipment, even the chargers for the phone, shut everything down, and then realised I'd left the hot tap on in the bathroom.
Well, that's the thing about the modern world, isn't it? When we were talking about these stories of Milarepa, I mean, he's going off to a cave in the remote Himalayas, and all his only possession, or two possessions, is a cotton cloth that he wears and a bowl and a cave. So there's not so much to maintain
yes.
in a cave. I mean, perhaps a fire, perhaps tallow, wax for lighting, and or so they burning herbs and preparing food, and you need certain kind of facilities to enable you to do the practicalities of everyday life. You can't escape them unless you're giving up food or quite extreme. But so in a cave, you don't necessarily have to remember to unplug something or.
Well, yes.
But in the modern world, then you're right. I mean, to prepare a space like that, where you can just forget about if the kettle's boiling or if the food's ready, or if someone's going to phone me. If you can drop those things for just a time, once a day, you don't have to necessarily learn meditation, do you? I mean, you were talking about the shamanic tradition.
Yes.
In fact, Milarepa came from a shamanic tradition himself, as we were talking about in the last chat, weren't we, about how he'd been involved in black magic and things, and Bun shamanism of Tibet.
Yes.
Has these very much a shamanic tradition. So if we're making a time of day that we're setting by for, some people say prayers, don't they? But if you're not religiously inclined, or you don't necessarily want to have to sing a mantra or sit still, the old shamanic ways and the old folk ways of making a very simple connection every day would have been simply by orientating yourself in space. So you go to a tree or a stone or a spot where you know, and you stand and you face north. Because you know where north is, and if you don't, then you have a marker to show you where north is. I happen to be facing north right now, funnily enough, so the sun is setting to my west as I speak. I know that. I don't even have to look. I know that the sun's come up in the eastern direction. I know that at midday behind me, whilst I'm facing in this direction, at midday the sun would have been in the south. So if we orientate ourselves, that's such a fundamental, isn't it, to where we are in space, with north, east, south, west, and also we mustn't forget above direction and below direction, and then last of all within. And so the within direction, the one people often forget the above and below, don't they? The under our feet and above our head, this vertical axis. But also people have a tendency sometimes to forget about the seventh direction, which is the inward direction.
Which, from where you are pointing, seems to relate to the heart chakra?
Yes.
I would think so.
Our centre.
Is that the middle in the seventh chakra system?
It is, and it's also... so there are three chakras above the heart chakra and three chakras below the heart chakra in the seven chakra system of centres aligned along the spine. So if you're, for instance, in the Tibetan tradition, we talked about this before, didn't we, John? They have these stupas, these cone-shaped towers.
Yes.
That Milarepa was actually asked by his teacher Milarepa to build one of these towers with the varying levels of degrees of initiation, but usually related to the elements. And we've talked about this before: earth, water, fire, air, space, energy, consciousness. And these are aligned as levels up the stupa, these towers, to help the practitioner to understand the different levels of consciousness that these stupas represent. These stupas represent in Tibet.
So in the northern Buddhist tradition, this was a part of the meditational path.
Exactly.
And in the case of Milarepa, it was a physical building.
Exactly. Well, that was the teaching, wasn't it? So Milarepa's saying to Milarepa, look, I want you to build this tower, and Milarepa's thinking, this is really mundane. What
to
does it
live the
mean?
life, to build the tower, to ring the bell, to be yourself. And he did, but it was hard work.
It externally and internally. So it's hard work for him building a physical structure to these dimensions that he was asked to do, and he didn't quite understand why he was being asked to do it. This
But
is
he did
Milarepa,
know
but his
that
teacher.
Master Milarepa had put into practice, along with his predecessors, discipline that was true, fitted in with the shamanic practices of Tibet, and had a structure that was more accessible generally to the Western mind, because we'd been initiated through the British Empire in India as to other philosophies, and started to get an inkling of a kind of Buddhism that seems quite different to the Western world, and yet some of the tenets of Buddhism are deeply enshrined in the philosophies of pretty well all people in all lands, because they're based on the common law that all beings in all places share as a consciousness that is in the process of being raised into understanding a wider abundance can be achieved when harmonic cycles are actively produced, sought and opened for want of a
Very, very well
harmonious
put, John.
word.
That's the stupa, isn't it? I was just where you said actually used the word raised. So as Milarepa is being asked by Milarepa, his teacher, to raise this tower level by level, different shapes, different geometries are involved. He doesn't quite understand why, but he's asked to carry on anyway. And when he finally finishes the hard work physically that's involved in building that stupa for his master, his Milarepa, trying to figure out why, when he finally gets to finishing the tower, Milarepa, his teacher, comes to him and says, okay, you've been wanting me to give you these teachings, you've been harassing me all this time to give me these teachings, and you can't understand why I've simply been asking you to build this tower. Well, I can now tell you that the reason I've been asking you to build this tower is because each level you've been building represents a particular state of consciousness, that when you raise the tower, when you know what each level represents, you're raising your consciousness to the point where the top of the tower is representing the highest possibility for your consciousness. And this is a very structured system that was put in place by Milarepa. And so then he was able to actually give Milarepa finally the teachings that he'd been asking him for so long, which were the introductions to the different levels of consciousness and stages of meditation to reach the goal of liberation. So having built the tower, he could, when Milarepa explained these levels of consciousness and how to raise them through these practices, Milarepa was able to
understand in his body memory how to raise that particular vibration at that particular assemblage level of consciousness. And unlike a shaman who can turn into a crow, he was a human who turned into a man.
Well, this
And
is the interesting
I'd like to
transition,
say,
isn't it?
when he turned into a man, there's equally female monks in Tibet that turned into woman.
People and animals.
Yes, thank you.
This is the
A true person.
the transitions, isn't it, between these levels of consciousness. So again, in the Tibetan tradition, the 5 level stupas represent the 6 level, the 6 element stupas, the stupas that are each level, each of the 6 levels of the stupa is assigned to a level of consciousness and also an element. We've talked about this before. But the association of each element to a different state of consciousness is a perfect model to understand how one can raise one's consciousness from the base frequencies, which are the foundational earth element frequencies, to the highest frequencies, which is the jewel, which gives off a rainbow light, and that represents enlightenment. So that they place the jewel on the top of the stupa, that's the last thing that's done to finish the work of building the tower. Only when you really you lay that jewel on the top that represents pure consciousness, pure intelligence, universal intelligence or universal consciousness, and the rainbow body, the rainbow light that the jewel gives off, that's only placed when the person placing it fully understands or has some level of understanding as to what that is, what that represents. So by then, when you lay on the jewel to finish your work of the physical building, you've been given the teachings of each level. So Milarepa did give Milarepa those
teachings.
7 stages of meditation practice, different types of practicing that started off with the more shamanic bunpo practices, but by the end of the 7th level had gone beyond the animism and the elemental work and gone to a more spacious universal consciousness, pure consciousness level of experience. So that was the lesson for Milarepa in that story of him building the tower, wasn't it?
Well, it was indeed.
There was more to it than just raising a building. It was a way for him to access the teachings through that, and so it was already grounded in something that then he could practice around. Those stupas were the places where monasteries were founded initially. They would raise a stupa, like we would raise a stone, and then build a community around that centre, like a mandala. And so Milarepa would definitely have probably been the abbot of a monastery that had already been laid out, or had the potential to be laid out in this harmonic pattern. And the stupa was the way to establish the centre, a place where
one of the 7 times
a sacred centre.
When Milarepa was building the tower, there was a dispute as to whether Milarepa owned the land or not, and that was one reason for taking it back down again. There was another one when the other disciples of Milarepa just happened to leave a large block of stone around near where he was building the tower at that particular time, so he incorporated it as a foundation cornerstone. It was ideal for it. That was another reason for taking it down. There was a 3rd time I remember where the Tibetans have a drink, I think it's called chiang. It's fermented barley with rancid yak butter. They rather like it, with a bit of salt, I believe. And Milarepa got drunk, and that was another reason for having to take it back down again.
Very good reasons.
Milarepa was never short of a strange idea. He was certainly a match for Milarepa, and he had to be. I mean, who else?
Well, may we all learn from these teachings, these deep teachings in these funny stories, and I'd be great to continue these conversations with you on these stories of Milarepa, hopefully another time, John.
Absolutely. Well, within all of the talks, we thank our viewers, and we hope what we've said has been interesting so far. We're going to have a short break. We wish you well. Love to all beings.
May the spirit of Milarepa go with you.
And there's a saying at Christmas time. Is it peace to all men of goodwill?
Peace to all beings, love to all beings.
Agreed. Good evening.
Thank you, John.